Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our March Green Socialist Organizing Project 101 workshop. This month we are doing Decentralization 101. This is part of our recurring 101 series. We do them on the fourth Tuesday of every month at 8 p.m. Eastern. In 2022, when we started the series, we did a recurring Green Party 101, Eco-Socialism 101, Organizing 101. We'll still touch on those in 2023, but as you can see, we're branching off a little into some kind of major tangents that come out of those. So in February, we did Independent Politics 101, and this month we're going to do Decentralization 101. Next month in April, we're going to do a Eco-Socialist Green New Deal 101 as part of a series of events for Earth Day to May Day. So that's what we've got coming up with our 101s. As usual, I am Chris Blankenhorn. I'm the Illinois Green Party Secretary and a former GPUS co-chair. I also served as the Hawkins-Walker 2020 Social Media and Tech Director. And with me is Garrett Wasserman. I'll let Garrett introduce himself.
Yeah, everyone, I'm Garrett Wasserman. I'm a former GPUS Green Party National co-chair, as well as a member of my local and state Green Party of Pennsylvania. And I've been involved in ballot access work and working on several campaigns here in Pennsylvania. So welcome, everybody. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, and as I said at the beginning, this is a monthly workshop that we do on the fourth Tuesday of every month. You can learn more about this 101 series, see what's coming up next, watch old sessions and things like that at greensocialist.net/101s, and you can get more involved with the Green Socialist Organizing Project broadly at greensocialist.net. You can see all of our resources, like in the education department. You can sign up to become a member and get involved that way. So without further ado, we'll get started on our Decentralization 101 workshop. So to start off, what is decentralization, right? One of the reasons we end up talking about it so much is because it is one of the Green Party's 10 key values. It's number 5 for the U.S. Green Party. So that's why you hear a lot about it when you're in green, in green circles, because it's one of the 10 key values that guide our party. But what is decentralization? It's activities, planning, decision-making that are distributed away from a central authoritative group. What that looks like is completely different whether we're talking about a decentralized organizing in a local chapter versus how it plays out on the national level. Right, so there's kind of decentralized systems within decentralized systems in what the Green Party says that they strive for. So that key value says centralization of wealth and power contributes to social and economic injustice, environmental destruction, and militarization. We seek restructuring of social, political, and economic institutions away from a system controlled by and mostly benefiting the powerful few to a democratic, less bureaucratic system. Decision-making should, as much as possible, remain at the individual and local level while assuring the civil rights are protected for all. So we're not just talking about how we structure the Green Party when we talk about decentralization, right? We're talking about how we structure society. We're talking about, a radical alternative to the highly centralized and hierarchical capitalist system that we live in. Even within social democracies with strong social welfare states, it's mostly centralized top-down society, and that's kind of at the core of why we as Greens value decentralization. A way, if people aren't familiar of thinking about this, it's the bottom left of the political spectrum that you see all over, right? As opposed to the top left, which would be statist formations like Maoists and things like that, Leninists and the such. So Garrett, do you have anything to add? Just kind of starting off. We'll get into details on whether the Green Party, lives up to these values, and why we should try to live up to them, why we should maintain this model. But anything open to add, Garrett?
Yeah, I'll just kind of emphasize the point here that decentralization is kind of a general principle that we're trying to apply not only to the Green Party, not only to the structure of a political party or a political movement, and not only the structure of a government or the what we typically think of as government, right? Kind of social decision making. It's also decentralization in economics and the way that we produce things and distribute things. Some examples that we'll get into more, but for example, decentralizing our food production away from very centralized things. It's not only corporate control, but it's also making sure that things are decentralized to make more sense ecologically. One point that is important here is that decentralization, and this is where it gets complicated for a lot of folks, is that we shouldn't look at decentralization as one point by itself. We should look at it as how it interacts with the rest of the pillars and the key values of the Green Party or the Green movement in general, to kind of help define exactly what decentralization means in all of these different contexts, in the economy and in local governments and parties and things like that. So we'll get more into it, but I just wanted to point that out, that that's kind of where a lot of the nuance comes from. If you only talk about this definition here, you're kind of missing the forest for the trees, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you'll see why as we talk about it more, right? But the reality is that in order to operate effectively, decentralization requires more effective and efficient communication, more effective and effective and efficient organizing than centralized does. It offers a lot of great benefits, fluidity and empowering people at the grassroots level. But to do it effectively, especially as we'll talk about on the large continental scale, like we talk about in the United States, it really requires a high level of collaboration and coordination and communication. And if it doesn't, then it can fall into some pretty serious pitfalls. So with that, those pitfalls, right? Some problems with decentralization, right? That it's not a perfect organizing system. No one's discovered a perfect organizing system, either socially or, kind of in terms of, radical community and political organizing. If one of us had figured out the secret, we wouldn't be where we're at today, I guess is the simple way to say it, right? So some problems of decentralization. It can lead to an overemphasis on localism and self-sufficiency, right? And that can lead to a whole bunch of problems, like they can become isolated and xenophobic, even unecological in ways, instead of part of a global movement, right? So decentralization can lead to us being in silos, right? Especially if we don't have, like I said, those finely tuned communications and coordination systems. Then even if we wanted to talk and coordinate, it's hard to do. And so we just kind of get reverted back into our bubble. And it's never good to be organizing in a bubble. An overemphasis on local production can lead to cooperative capitalism. Capitalism's a global system, right? And it can't be explicitly, it can't be sufficiently addressed solely at a local level, right? You're still going to have to engage in the broader capitalist, economy and global marketplace. So even if you do have a more egalitarian local approach, it's going to be interconnected in a whole bunch of ways, at least in the foreseeable short term, right? With larger global capitalism. And this has been something that, a critique that's been, levied against, large socialist projects, throughout history, right? I mean, as early as the 1920s, almost immediately after the Russian Revolution, the people like Gramsci were critiquing it, and saying, this is state-run, but but still within the capitalist system. They didn't break free. Mao openly talked about it, right? Openly admitted it in his writings. and then it can lead to reasons for real critique, right? Like looking at a project like Venezuela that's done many great things, in terms of housing and poverty and all these things, but it's a petro economy, right? It's based solely their economy is heavily dependent on oil production. So it's an unecological system, even though it is more egalitarian, right? And because we're not able to address these fundamentals of capitalism at that local level alone, it can, as we become more localist and more isolated, our effectiveness in actually achieving broad change is going to be limited. So we've got to watch for that when we're doing decentralized organizing, and we need to make sure that we have inclusiveness in decision making at the grassroots level, right? It's one thing we'll definitely probably get into more later, but decentralization doesn't mean we can't have centralized planning and centralized funding. It means that we need to have decentralized democracy and democratic decision making and control at the local level. No state in this country has the funding presently to be able to adequately provide a real Medicare for all solution for everybody, right? It's just the federal level is the only place where that level of funding can easily be attained. So when we say we want Medicare for all, that's obviously a centralized system, but we need to make sure that it's community controlled through community health boards, and that local communities are controlling their budget, are controlling where their resources are allocated, and things like that. So having that inclusiveness in community decision making is essential to effective decentralized society. And then decentralization doesn't necessarily mean there is no hierarchy. The feudal era in Europe was highly decentralized with royalty. Joe Freeman's The Tyranny of Structurelessness is a great piece that every community organizer or political organizer should read, especially those that are operating within organizations that claim to want to successfully organize in a decentralized way. You should read it, and Joe Freeman's piece, because it really has some great points on like it says in there, the informal hierarchies, the way that lax bylaws are used by people who can leverage the way things are done, right? Decentralization doesn't mean there's no hierarchy, or no rules or anything like that. It's not chaos. It actually takes a high level of precision and efficiency. Garrett?
Yeah, I agree. The decentralization, you kind of have to look back a little bit toward history, and that's kind of what Joe Freeman was talking about in the essay here, that as kind of a response both to capitalism, but also this very statist version of socialism that you would see, back in the 60s and things. They were very centralized and very controlling, and tended to kind of tell members, you had to act certain ways or do certain things or whatever. And so there was this kind of anti-authoritarian backlash where a lot of groups at that time period wanted to, had good goals and good motives to try to avoid any sort of authoritarian structure, but then they kind of got lost in this decentralization thing where they were so afraid of being authoritarian that they didn't want to make any sort of formal rules or formal structure or anything like that. And the problem with that was that actually created its own version of authoritarian sort of structures. They just were hidden. They just were kind of behind the scenes in closed rooms and that sort of thing. They were these more informal hierarchies between people that knew each other and could, behind the scenes talk to each other and make decisions and things, because there was no formal process. There was no formal way that members could hold that structure accountable. So instead it happened behind the scenes. So that's one thing that can unfortunately go wrong with decentralization if we're not careful. So we want to kind of really point out this thing here, that decentralization doesn't mean a lack of rules or a lack of accountability to the broader movement. In fact, it has to be more accountable, if anything, for it to work properly. And when it's working properly, it's very good. But you have to make sure that it works properly, and you have to balance that with criticisms that you see from other folks who will argue for a more centralized version of a socialist party or something like that by saying, if you're too off on your own and you get stuck in this very localism thing, it's a legit point that you can become very siloed, and instead of working with others, you become afraid of others or very isolated from yourself or from others, right? So what we're trying to do is find this balance here, that we don't want to become too centralized, of course, but if there's no rules at all, if it's kind of free for all, I don't want to tell you what to do, then that breaks down and kind of creates its own informal hierarchies. So when we're talking decentralization, we're trying to find that nice sweet spot there where folks have lots of autonomy to do things, and the decision making happens at local levels, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a certain amount of kind of administrative connection between everything, communications and accountability and things like that.
Yeah, and another big area that I realized isn't on here is that without clear processes, right, without democratically decided, conflict resolution, things like that, how a meeting's ran, right, when it descends into chaos, right, when there's no rules, it leaves it wide open for abuse by bad actors, right, because it means that there's no way to, interpersonal conflict can literally tear the entire organization apart. It's happened so many times, where you would think that organizations wouldn't be that susceptible, but when there's no clear path to, resolve issues, then they can often burn out of control. When there is, a clear bad actor, there's often no, there's often no way to actually address them, right? To remove them from the group, to engage in disciplinary action. And often when disciplinary action is taken in decentralized groups, there's a backlash against it because it's seen as, authoritarianism for even justified, disciplinary action on members or anything like that. So, and that goes to society too, right? When I look at our society, when I look at, an example I think of is local music cultures. I don't think I've ever encountered a local music culture that didn't have a problem with predatory behavior, where there wasn't a problem with people in bands dating way younger and underage people, that there wasn't a problem with, the cool kids getting away with stuff. It's every music culture I've encountered has had a level of this, right? And when we look at our society, we don't have means for conflict resolution, right? We have a justice system that is ineffective in a lot of the things I just talked about, but also it isn't designed for restorative justice. It's not designed for addressing issues. It's designed to punish, right? Or probably more accurately, it's designed to create revenue. In our modern, justice system.
It's also set up to be very adversarial as opposed to working together to actually solve the issue.
Yeah. So when we, even outside of talking about the Green Party, like in our local neighborhoods, in our local communities, we have a complete lack of processes and institutions and outlets to engage in restorative justice, to engage in conflict resolution. Our society doesn't provide them, and most of our institutions don't, our civic institutions and political institutions don't provide them adequately either. So without those things, it's very hard to, rein in problems and things like that. Whereas, I've been part of centralized organizations where, whole chapters could be thrown out on the whim of individuals in charge, right? So like Garrett said, it's a balancing act. But I do think, one bullet point that we should have put on here was that how much it opens up for bad actors if you don't have these processes, and how that can completely derail all the work that's, being done. You want to take this one, Garrett?
Yeah, sure. So we kind of talked about some of the major critiques or criticisms or problems that you might run into with decentralization, which a lot of those criticisms are very legitimate. things can go very wrong when there are bad actors and all, like Chris is talking about. But the question, of course, becomes, how do you deal with those issues? What sort of organizational structure should you have in order to take advantage of decentralization, to actually make decentralization work, to create broader freedom and broader democracy and all for folks without falling into those traps? And I think a good way to look at it, and an underlying principle that GPUS tries to use, and again, we'll get to that in a moment about how well it's done it so far. But a principle of that is to form a federation or maybe a confederation. My understanding is that the federation is, I think GPUS is technically a confederation, because I think a confederation is where the broader group is equal with the members, as opposed to the federation that is, federal structure of the U.S. government. The federal government is over everyone else. It overrules them. So when we're talking confederations, we're talking the network of communities is kind of part of the community itself. Maybe it's a little bit funny sounding, but anyway, you'll see. So one form of confederalism is this idea that you have this network of administrative councils or committees, or whatever you want to call it, where members are elected from assemblies. So what you're talking about is trying to empower local levels, the local party, local government, whatever. Those local groups from towns, neighborhoods, whatever, are the ones that actually do most of the decision making. And once they've come to an agreement, once they've decided to take some action, then you elect someone to be a delegate or a member or steering committee member, that kind of thing, to carry out that action. And that person is empowered to do those things as well as held accountable for it. And so what's important for all this stuff is that anyone who's elected to these positions, such as delegates and all, they should be mandated. Whoever they're representing should give them tasks and say specifically, this is what we would like you to do. That way we can hold you accountable, that it's not someone just going off on their own and saying whatever they want and doing whatever they want and voting for whatever they want. They need to be accountable. So they need to have a conversation with their local community who gives them guidance, who gives them mandates on what they're supposed to do when they go and work with other delegates. And they need to be recallable in order to make sure that they're actually held accountable. That if they go off the rails and they start promising things they shouldn't have or whatever it is, they can be recalled, and someone who better represents the community can go and do that, fulfill that task. So this is meant to be very administrative, carrying out decisions that have already been made by the whole community, as opposed to the representative system in the U.S., where somebody gets elected and then they go make the decisions on their own with other representatives, and they don't consult us, right? They just pass laws and do things, and they don't have to talk to anyone, and right? They just go off and do things. It's meant to invert that structure where the decisions are made locally, and you're only electing the person to carry out that thing, to make sure it happens, to oversee it, to kind of be the manager of the project. But they didn't decide the project on their own, right? The communities did. So it's important to point out that they're administrative, not policy-making bodies. That's what we're talking about here. And to try to avoid some of the problems that we talked about earlier of siloing ourselves, isolating ourselves, we have to make sure that the members, the communities that are part of this network, that are part of this confederation, they need to be independent. They need to rely on mutualism, where they're sharing resources, and if it's economic, sharing production, sharing policy-making decisions, things like that, so that you're not isolated, you're not siloed, that you're actually making decisions as part of a broader community that's looking at the bigger picture, right? That whatever decisions you're making make sense within the entire structure and the goal of the entire community, and not just some little group that you're a part of, right? Because again, that's where it gets off the rails, where someone can, one town, if you're talking economics, one town can say, well, it's good for our workers if we, create a mining facility or whatever it is, and it dumps all the chemicals that go downstream to another community. They could say, well, hey, decentralization, my town can decide if we want to do mining. But really, like now when you're talking about environmental issues, it's not affecting just that one town. It's affecting the broader community. And that's the point of having this network, that we have to have these conversations about how do our local decisions impact the entire community. And we have to have accountability through that mechanism. So this is kind of the very broad idea of what a confederation should look like that tries to promote the most democracy and the most decentralization with communities making their own decisions while still being accountable to the broader membership, broader community. So go ahead with your comments, Chris.
Yeah, and we've seen, I think probably the two most well-known examples of this would be Rojava in the Kurds in Syria, and then the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico, right? Where and the Zapatistas, formed out of this, art-filled revolution, in response to NAFTA, right? And in response to and many other things, right? That was much more complex, obviously, than just a trade agreement, but that was kind of the news event that was, happening and affecting at the time, right? But even and so what you saw was, an indigenous uprising, and where communities took gained in some level of independent power. They collaborate as a community across the region. But there's local democracy, and it's similar with in the Kurds. It's called democratic confederatism, right? Sorry, night. Go with mommy. Night, buddy. Sorry, it's bedtime for toddler. So that's where we see this kind of in practice internationally, right? That's the projects that we can look to. When Garrett was talking about the difference between a federal system and a confederate system, GPUS, right, is a good example of that, right? Because GPUS, the Green Party of the United States, is made up of its member states and caucuses, right? It cannot dictate to those states and caucuses. In fact, its path is decided by the delegates elected to the National Committee. And that has a varying level of effectiveness that we'll get into later, right? But it's a confederated system where the member states are actually the power. And most Green parties in the United States operate the same way on the state level as well, right? The coordinating committee for the Illinois Green Party is basically the managers between our biannual full membership meetings, right? Our path is guided by the members. It says in the Illinois Green Party bylaws, the membership is the highest decision-making body. So that's what you get out of a confederate system, right? But the confederate system does it through representative democracy, right? Through delegates, instead of necessarily doing it through direct democracy. And an interesting way we see this play out too, right, is even though the Green Party is a decentralized confederate system, we're running in top-down elections for top-down seats in government. And when we look at a tangential or a parallel organization in DSA, we can see that there's a problem when you're electing people into the system with accountability, right? And over the years, we've seen this pop up numerous times in DSA, where their membership realizes once someone's elected, it doesn't matter that DSA endorsed them or if they're a member, they really have no control, no level of accountability. They can't recall them. All they can really do is revoke their membership, which they tend to vote against doing, like they did with Jamal Bowman and BDS. Or they, could revoke their endorsement, but the person's already in office, right? So even when we do try to organize internally within, with a different mindset, we're still electing people into an extraordinarily top-down and hierarchical system that is designed for a lack of accountability. And we talked about that last week in our independent politics workshop, right? Or last month in our independent politics workshop, right? That the U.S. political system is designed to be memberless. It's designed so that the people don't actually have any route directly to power or any ability to hold accountability outside of, two-party elections. And that's by design. So Even when we do try this out, we're still operating. It's the problem with that localism, right? Even if we're talking about the Green Party of the United States, or the Green Party globally, right, which is a political organization with 100 plus member countries, we're still operating within global capitalism, and it causes problems when those two systems butt heads. So that's kind of thinking about decentralization in terms of how to run a society, right, and how to organize society in a decentralized way, and that's based on the meaning of confederalism by Murray Bookchin, which kind of raises the question, what should democracy look like? It should be direct. Decisions are made directly by people. Power remains in the hands of the people themselves. It should be participatory, structured for involvement of everyone. All can participate in matters of common life and influence those matters. It should be deliberative. Decisions emerge from processes of discussion and consensus building, rather than merely the results of formal proceduralism, where we are tallied as isolated voters. It should be radical. Democratic principles are expanded into all spheres of life, not just what we know as government today, but also into economic planning, production, distribution, as well as housing, stewardship over environment, etc. And it should be revolutionary. Democracy is in itself a process of social transformation, where the power of people sets out on a collision course with the privileges of the elites, where the foundations of the old system are consciously uprooted and a new system is created into the social reality, right? So I think those are all really good ways to kind of evaluate our democracy, right? Direct, how direct? What if we're talking about representative democracy? How much control do people have? How is what are members? What are voters? What is our power of recall? Things like that. It should be participatory. How much do people actually engage, right? In the United States, our electoral system is not very direct, and it does not encourage participation. We have other countries. I think Australia mandates voting. I'm pretty sure that's who I'm thinking of that does. But we have some countries that mandate voting. You get fined if you don't, right? But that doesn't mean that you have a participatory system, and that means you have a mandatory system, right? It's not just the act of voting that determines whether or not you participate in democracy. We're talking about local, communal councils and boards and every act of civic engagement.
That's partly why we include the next principle of deliberative, that it's not enough for people to just go vote. They've got to be able to participate not only by voting or kind of expressing their opinions or whatever, but that their opinions are actually taken into account as part of the process, a consensus building process that will actually influence the end result.
Yeah, and when you look at what we do now, it's just majority rule, right? And majority rule sets up for a large unhappy minority, especially when it's just bulldozed through, right? Bulldozing through is something the Republicans have shown very good at, and the Democrats have shown unwilling to do, right? And when we're looking at the effects of that now, right? Roe versus Wade has been dropped in multiple chances to enshrine Roe in law instead of in precedent, were passed up by the Democratic Party. So just the ability to pass something is not in and of itself mean that it is democratic or that it represents a large group of people. So it's important to even if it's not consensus, right? I'm sure we could have a long debate amongst people on the left about consensus. I'm sure Garrett and I could have a long debate amongst each other about consensus. And I would say we are both pro-consensus people. But even if we're not talking about, orthodox consensus, right? The process needs to be deliberative so that people's concerns are heard, not only heard, but addressed, right? It shouldn't be, well, if we got 51%, we don't care. That creates someone who's not happy within their society, especially when you look at, just look at the United States. This is the direct outcome of majority rule, and non-participatory, non-direct, non-radical, non-revolutionary politics.
Flipping between presidents that each get 51% of the vote, so half the country's always angry. Yeah.
And the idea of expanding democracy into all spheres of life is incredibly radical, right? And it's necessary. This is when we talk about economic democracy, when we talk about socialism, right? Worker ownership. We're talking about expanding democracy outside of just the electoral system, which in the United States isn't democratic at all, right? But the same when you look at our economic sphere, right? We don't have a democratic economic system, right? We have a system, an incredibly hierarchical capitalist system, right? That is so powerful that it even influences our political system most of the time. And so one of the most radical things we can do is spread democracy throughout our lives, not just, talking about democracy as in voting and electoralism, but democracy in our workplace, democracy in our community, democracy in our neighborhoods, right? Community assemblies and, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Any place really that there needs to be decision making, beyond, I guess, very simple things in your personal life, we should think about how we can democratize that process. And so that's beyond, traditional government and voting and things. And that's also beyond the traditional kind of union focus on workplaces. There's a lot of things that go into our communities where we need to have this participatory deliberative structure that tries to get as many people involved in that process as possible. Not everyone works in the same workplace. You can't focus only on unions. Government as it exists today, it doesn't necessarily, in fact, it puts way too much into the market and things like that. It doesn't actually oversee a lot of this stuff. It leaves the decisions to wealthy people is essentially what leaving it to the market means. So instead of having that process, we want to have this participatory process that includes everyone in the community in making that decision, as opposed to leaving it to wealthy people or political insiders and things like that. And just to kind of throw in a point there on what Chris said about consensus and all. I think one thing to try to avoid that sort of debate here is a lot of folks confuse consensus with unanimous. Unanimous meaning that everyone has to agree. And consensus is not necessarily unanimous. It could be, and in certain decisions, maybe it should even be. But consensus is really the process. It's not really that outcome. The outcome of a consensus process could be unanimous. Everyone agrees. The outcome could be a vote. It could be a majority vote or a supermajority vote of 60 or 70% or whatever it is. The important point about consensus is that it's this deliberative process where everyone is getting together, discussing their concerns, their issues. They're being heard. They're being evaluated by all the membership, and you're working your way through that decision-making process to try to deal with as many problems as you possibly can, to deal with as many concerns as you can, because that's what participatory means, right? Having everyone involved, hearing all those concerns, and trying to address all of them in a fair, just, equitable way, all of those things.
Yeah, and a good example kind of how to think about, decentralized democracy, but still understanding the need for coordination and a level of centralized planning would be healthcare, right? If we were to implement the Medicare for all that progressive Democrats want, right, all alone, just open the rolls, let everyone in on Medicare. I would imagine that even if they could get that passed, it would contain caveats that private insurance gets to survive, right? Whereas, a true single payer system would end private insurance as well. For most things.
Even in the best case scenario that they eliminated private insurance or whatever it is,
the public option's the best they're ever going to get.
Yeah. You still have the problem of private for-profit hospitals and doctors' offices and pharmaceuticals and all these things. So we that's part of the democratization process of asking, how do we make the hospitals more democratic? And accountable to their communities? How do we make pharmaceuticals? There's important life-saving drugs, insulin and things that need to be made. How do we make that in our community in an accountable way and not necessarily the billionaires or whatever owning it or political elites and things like that? So Sorry, go ahead with Medicare.
Yeah, right. And so if we just get the public option, right, which like would be game changing for millions of people, right? So we shouldn't shit on that too much. But it essentially will be a feeding trough for these for-profit companies like private hospitals, private providers, private medical manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies, right? It'll be a slush fund that they can just pull from because we won't have removed, right, the profit motive from the entire sector. Much like we can't, implement decentralization solely at the local level, we can't implement, public health care solely at the level of insurance and payment. We need to, socialize the pharmaceutical industry. We need to implement a national health service where providers and medical manufacturers and things like that are all brought under social control. But even if we did that, right, through the most radical of things that we've seen through from progressive Democrats, or looking at England and their national health service, it still ran top down, right? A budget is passed at the top level. It is distributed amongst people, amongst the different regions, and then they get to do what they can with it. When we're talking about decentralized, bottom-up, community-controlled health, national health service, which is what we in the 2020 campaign called for. What we called for was local health boards that were made up of community members, that were made up of the doctors and the nurses and the frontline workers at the actual providers themselves, and that instead of doing what they could with a budget, they would send a budget of what they needed, and the responsibility of the legislature was to provide the funding that was necessary. Right. And then at the local level, they can address, like, where do we have shortfalls? I live in a medical district. I can literally see two hospitals from my house. Right. Why are they right next to each other when there's whole areas of town that don't have coverage? Why? And same thing with, smaller providers that aren't hospitals. They're all grouped around the hospitals. They're grouped around in the more wealthy white area of town. Right. Leaving most of the working class and most of the people of color in town with limited access. And so when we bring in community control, when we reverse the flow of power from coming down, top down, to going bottom up, it is a revolutionary thing that can completely change the game for us. So that's, what does decentralization look like for society? What does decentralization look like for democracy? Now we're going to go into what does decentralization look like for organizing, right? The work that we do in our communities, the work that we do, in terms of the Green Party of the United States on the national level, which we'll get into that in a minute. But decentralization allows for more fluidity and adaptability on the local level, right? And this is super important for a continental grassroots party. And I really want people in the United States on the left to kind of take this idea in, that we're doing continental organizing. We're organizing on a massive geographic scale, right? In 2018, I was in Amsterdam, and I met with a Green City councilor from Amsterdam. And one of the things I walked away struck by was she could get anywhere in her country in 2 hours on public transit. Anywhere in the country, she could be there on public transit in 2 hours. I can't get out of my state in 2 hours. And public transit, I guess there's Amtrak a few times a day that will get me there eventually, right? But it'd be faster in my car. Right. So I think we really need to kind of have that understanding. And what does that mean? What does being continental organization mean? It means that we really have to be fluid and collaborative in kind of working with the various regional and different geographic needs, right? I said it in the next one. Decentralization allows chapters and organizers to focus their energies on issues that align with their unique local conditions, right? What the climate crisis looks like plays out differently in California than the Midwest than the Gulf, right? What environmental action looks like can vary greatly from place to place. If we're totally top down and taking orders from the top, it's going to be really hard for us to align. And I've done this, right? I've worked in organizations where the directions came from the top, and I felt like I was slamming my head against the wall, trying to explain that top expectation didn't apply to my community. So decentralization allows us to say we're fighting, we're taking action on the climate, but what it looks like it's different in different communities. And by being able to adapt and engage in issues like this and in ways that relate to our local communities, our work is more likely to connect with community members, right? If you're Garrett, where they're fracking the hell out of Pennsylvania, right? Engaging in anti-fracking activities makes a whole lot of sense. If you're in Illinois, where the Sierra Club and the Illinois Environmental Council got together with the Democratic Party and the oil and gas industry and legalized it, but we still don't have enough for it to be economical, and there's not a single fracked well here, right? It doesn't make a whole lot of a sense for us to engage in that. So if we got a top-down order to engage on to push back on fossil fuel usage, for instance, fracking is going to be key over there, right? But in Illinois, we're going to want to be talking about pipelines because in South Central Illinois, we have a Enbridge hub where the Dakota Access goes to, the Keystone hits. Like, we've got multiple pipelines hitting in one town and then shipping out to the Gulf or shipping out to the East Coast, right? So what it looks like is different. And if you come into most of Illinois talking about fracking, people are going to stop listening to you, right? If you go to Southern Illinois and talk about it, they'll listen, because if it happens, that's where it's going to happen. But it hasn't really happened yet. So it looks different. And then decentralized organizing allows our members to engage on issues they're passionate about in ways that best utilize their skills and allows party resources to be devoted where members and energy should be focused. So decentralization makes it harder for us to put together large coordinated campaigns, right? Because the resources and direction aren't flowing from top down. It's harder for us to effectively coordinate, say, a national day of action. But what decentralization allows us to do is to tailor these broad issues that bring together what is the Green Party into our local concerns and our local actions. So decentralized organizing is really an important kind of methodology for organizing, because it flips that power dynamic, right? When you work with a group like the Sierra Club, it tends to be top down, right? They tell you what we're going to do, and you're part of we, but you didn't get a vote, right? You weren't in that backdoor meeting. You weren't in that backroom meeting where they decided what we were going to do. And so when you engage in decentralized grassroots organizing, it flips that script and it brings power to people. And when people get that power and begin to understand that power and are allowed to engage in ways that excite them, right, then that's when you can actually start to harness the power of people against this massive amount of money and institutional power we're facing up against.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's important to throw in there that it's not necessarily an either or. It's a process of building. That's what organizing is about. It's about building. It's about building the structures and the power necessary to carry out our bigger goals, to make the bigger systemic change that we're really looking for. So, one way to do that is to get folks excited and passionate. Well, they're already excited and passionate about whatever's going on in their community. They live that every day. They understand the importance of that and what the problems are and why they need to be tackled. So we want to start by listening. If you've heard our old organizing 101s, right? You do more listening than preaching, right? You listen to them first and you hear their concerns and you encourage them, you empower them. You say, how can I help you with those local things? And that's part of our network. That's part of our party. How can we help each other with these local things? And eventually that builds to a larger national or continental movement, because if we're looking at those local events, but connecting them back to capitalism, connecting them back to the root causes of all these problems, it initially looks like every local or region is looking at different problems, but you're slowly building a movement where we're all recognizing that no, these are actually all stemming from the same underlying issues. And that's the powerful moment where that local organizing turns into national organizing and turns into this big mass movement, which is what we ultimately need. But it starts local, and it starts in this decentralized thing where you want to focus on the important things in each community and help those organizers with those local issues that can easily reach people and bring them into the movement.
Yeah, and and allowing people to engage in things they're passionate about in ways that they that highlight their skills. There's nothing worse than saying I want to be involved and then be giving a task that's not suited for you whatsoever. Right? That's why we have to listen first. That's why we have to have conversations. That's why we have to be real grassroots and not astroturf. Right?
Yeah. And why it's so important to have an educational movement as part of this broader movement for socialism. We're engaging here in the Green Socialist Organizing Project, but also the Youth Caucus and the Green Party and all sorts of other organizations. The important way to start is through education. Like I said, connecting those local issues to the broader, the root issues at the core of all this, at the core of capitalism and hierarchy and all those problems. And in the meantime, making sure that we're providing resources to people, which, like Chris says, includes listening to them, what they're passionate about, finding out what their skills are, and linking them to the things that can put their skills to use toward the things they're interested in. And if they don't have skills in that particular topic, to set up mentoring and training programs, and also that we are building skills. That's a good way to burn out organizers, to throw everything on one person. Part of your education movement has to be training folks to become organizers themselves and go off and keep organizing, right? Keep building the movement.
Yeah, and a prime example of that kind of pulling everything back, to those key values, right? That I always think of is the LGBTQIA organization ACT UP. It was founded during the AIDS crisis, and they had this just one. They were radical, and confrontational, but they had this ability to hit on across all sectors of society, but always come back to the AIDS crisis, right? So one day they're at Wall Street and they're protesting outside the stock exchange about their complicity in the AIDS crisis, and then the next day they're at the CDC, and then the next day they're at Pfizer, right? And then the next day they're at the county health department, right? And they were able, and that gives like a kind of a breadth of who you're impacting, right? And who you're speaking to. And it also allows for, if you've got all these different targets that you're going for, it allows for people to kind of work where they want to work, where they're passionate about, right? The one person who was turned away from their county health department is probably going to be more passionate about getting to, going to that and organizing around that county health department protest as compared to the person who can't afford their meds and is going to want to go after big pharma, right? So by the decentralization allows people to kind of track to what they're interested in. And then you kind of see this natural, organic, this is what we're doing, right? And instead of there being a meeting where you go through strategic planning, which is incredibly important and you should totally do, but instead of, coming through this like academic top-down people in the room decision about the path of your organization, when you start organizing in a decentralized way, all of a sudden you're going to kind of see these nodes of activity popping up, right? And as they start popping up, your organization's job is to start feeding them, right? These are the areas that people are passionate about working in. These are the areas where we're getting traction, right? These are the areas where we found a void and no one else is talking about it. And so instead of saying, oh, I know you really like that issue, and I know you've got all kinds of people coming out to your stuff, but like we had a meeting and we said we were doing this thing, right? That's a top-down authoritative organizing that we're trying to get away from. And in that example, it's actively stifling, right, activity and growth. So when we do this kind of decentralized organizing, it's a huge benefit for us that it allows people to engage where they want to engage in the ways that they want to engage, and then it allows this kind of organic bubbling up of what is actually important in our community, right? Because a lot of times if I put out a survey, right, that's what each individual thinks. And if I'm not surveying the community if I'm not casting a wide net, I'm going to get a very isolated view. So the ability for decentralized organizing to shift and adapt and take on what is, moving people is essential to our growth, I would say. So how do we live up to it as Greens? Does GPUS live up to decentralized democracy? I've been saying since we decided to do this one that my job here is to not be too harsh on this topic. But while decentralization requires, as we said earlier, requires a high level of communication and collaboration, GPUS's version of decentralization has tended to be more chaos and disconnect. Communication lines are not great. And because, another thing I think that needs to be addressed is that because we're an all volunteer organization for the most part, it means that we're relying on people that have a lot of other things on their plate, a lot of other things, that they have responsibilities for. So that all volunteer organization means that we need to have more backups, right? We need to have more people involved in the organizing so that things don't get dropped. In GPUS, the focus on localism and isolation and a lack of a clear and effective communications pipelines has led to a lack of focus and ability to do coordinated actions, right? And this has been something that the Green Party's kind of been going through right now internally, is like, we want to do this thing, but how and can we? Right? What is the value of it? I think most Greens that operate within the National Party have this kind of question in their mind of what is the value of a national committee proposal and declaration, right? If it doesn't come with mandates for states, if it doesn't come with action steps that are clear and able to be taken, if it's not clearly communicated back to the member parties that are actually the power of the Confederation, what does that mean, right? And so that's an area where the Green Party's kind of fallen into kind of dysfunctional decentralization. Decentralization, like we talked about earlier, in the Green Party, it's often been used to shield bad actors from accountability, and GPUS lacks effective conflict resolution processes for either individual people or their member parties' caucuses. So this means that often conflict is just left unresolved. Bad actors are allowed to just stay, which means that the people that they were, going after or that they were causing problems for often leave. So basically, we often lose the good organizers at the expense of bad actors because we don't have proper processes in place to address it. And then, despite green values calling for grassroots direct democracy, and kind of anti-bureaucracy language that we read at the beginning from our 10 key values, GPUS is often extremely bureaucratic in function, and rank and file Greens are often completely disconnected from what's happening at the National Party, which frankly is good most of the time. But if the National Party were, functioning more effectively and efficiently, we would want that kind of, connection.
Yeah, I think kind of the theme here that's interesting, that I know I've experienced, and I think Chris did too, as being involved in the national committee and national stuff, is that while there's a lot of talk about being decentralized and what would you call it, like I suppose a will to be decentralized, what's kind of ironically occurred is that the focus on keeping the National Party decentralized and focused on member states is that we've lost focus on the fact that not all of the member states properly practice decentralized democracy themselves. And not all of the committees at the national level practice decentralized democracy, that they'll sometimes have a couple of co-chairs and a couple of members kind of make all the decisions, and they're not necessarily as deliberative and participatory and all that we talked about as they should be. Yeah. And so as a result of that, all of these different committees and even some state parties end up very isolated from each other and very siloed from each other. And so we don't have very good collaboration and communication across them. And our rank and file members, our local parties that often do a lot of really good work, a lot of good organizing work and activism work, and run local candidates and win local offices very regularly, that ends up very disconnected from the network of state parties and the national party. So I think some of our challenge here is that we have the right set of values and the right ideas, but not entirely the right implementation here of how the national party and how the state parties are supposed to interoperate and work together and hold each other accountable. Because part of the problem here is that if there's a problem in the national party is not empowered to really do anything because it's assumed that the state party will hold folks accountable. But again, if that state party is not necessarily living up to all of the decentralized values that we've talked about, then it's very hard to hold folks accountable, or at least it's a drawn out bureaucratic process with all of its problems, right? So these are the points I think we can look at to improve and better live up to those key values.
Yeah, it's almost built in. When GPUS was formed as a confederation of member states, GPUS was established to be the bureaucratic administrative body that acted as the conduit for collaboration for those things, right? So despite the 10 key values taking an anti-bureaucratic stance, GPUS was established as basically a solely bureaucratic body. And the problem, one of the key problems that I see is that there's not a lot of ways for states, which are the members, right, of GPUS, to actually exert power and affect change, right, or even talk to each other through communication, right? GPUS has kind of become a black hole for communication and power instead of a conduit that leads from one state to the other, right? There's just so many different ways, and we're actually going to move in right now and talk about, okay, so we were just pretty harsh on the party, but how could we improve it? You want to take this one, Garrett?
Yeah, so we ran through those complaints, I suppose, and kind of identified the lack of structure that supports proper bottom-up decision making and this direct, deliberative, participatory, confederal sort of democracy that we've been talking about as what we mean by a decentralized democracy. So the ways that we can counter it are to try to better involve people, to make it participatory, and to make it accountable, not just to abstract state parties and things, but abstract to actual members. So the first point here is to move to a membership-based party instead of the current structure, which is, as Chris pointed out, a confederation of state parties, these kind of like legal entities, so to speak. And as I mentioned, what happens with that is that the National Party assumes that state parties will take appropriate action to support the key values, to hold folks accountable, to recall people if there's a problem, things like that. But if the state parties are not based in these structures, if they don't have the right structures to hold their members accountable, it causes all kinds of trouble. And so you have this indirect disconnect here where members, individual people, are theoretically involved in their local and state parties, but then not directly in the national party. Everything that happens in the national party is through delegates. And so, you have this very indirect democracy instead of direct. So by switching to a membership party, we can actually engage all of our members. And those members can have direct accountability as individual members of the national party, not just their local and state party. They can actually directly influence decision-making and directly participate in decision-making, see what's going on, and not have these delegate intermediaries that kind of confuse the issue and the waters. Next up is to open that participation, which is, I guess, what I touched on a little bit here, open participation beyond the national committee structure. So again, the National Party currently empowers a national committee, which is made up of delegates that are elected from each of the state parties and caucuses. But that structure means that you have to go through your state party and become an elected delegate and be appointed to work on a committee and things like that. It's very bureaucratic in order to get involved in the national party. So instead, we have to think about how we can get our individual members at the local and state levels involved in the national party, not necessarily in all of the administrative work or whatever, but if there's a project, for example, if there's some kind of goal, if we want to say have a national Medicare for All rally day or something like that, there's got to be projects that are sponsored by the national party. And the National Party does its role of communicating to members and having a space where individual members across the country can come together in that space and participate in planning that event and making it happen and all the stuff that goes along with it. So we want to avoid this excessive bureaucracy that keeps things siloed in committees, and instead make it possible for groups of members to come together and participate in those projects and even declare their own projects. Like right now, there is no way for a group of Green Party members to go to the National Party and say, hey, we would like to have this particular thing happen, right? We want to host a rally in DC. We want to, start some sort of educational program. We want to host a fundraiser online or whatever. There's no real process for that. It's expected that you go through your state party and submit a proposal through your delegate, and it goes through this whole bureaucratic thing. There needs to be a proposal process where members can actually submit the proposal and then get the National Party support to work on that project outside of this very bureaucratic committee structure. We need to adopt better consensus processes. Like we were saying earlier, consensus is a process that needs to be deliberative and it needs to be participatory. We need to make sure that everyone who wants to be involved in that process, in that decision-making process, who has comments or feedback or concerns or anything like that, can be involved in it. So, for example, especially in this era of modern technology, and we saw it during the pandemic, if you hold meetings that are in person or even on calls or whatever that are at specific times, folks have jobs or, maybe they have to babysit their kids or they don't have a babysitter or whatever it is, right? Life happens. And so if there's things that happen specifically at a certain point in time or whatever, that might actually restrict people's ability to get involved in processes, to get involved in projects, to get involved in committees. That's happened where if you can't make the once a month committee call at precisely 8 p.m. Eastern on Tuesday or whatever, then you effectively don't have a say in what the committee's doing, because that's where all the formal decisions are made. So we want to open that up and we want to think about how can we have a better consensus process that can work for everyone and be inclusive of everyone, where we're gathering that feedback and integrating it into proposals and trying to refine them and make them the best possible things. In order to do that properly, we have to have better communication. Decentralization requires greater communication and organization to make that happen. So we have to think about our tools and our processes that are going to facilitate this sort of thing. And that might actually mean developing some of our own tools, because we don't really have a whole lot of our own great tools, for collaboration on particularly these politically minded projects. You can have things like Slack, for example, that are communication things, but they're kind of designed for jobs and not necessarily the deliberative sort of process that we want for organizing work. So we'll have to think more about the tools and the processes that we want to use to include everyone, and then what sort of tools would support those processes. And finally, we want to hold states and caucuses accountable. So as we mentioned several times, there's delegates who go to the national committee and are not necessarily. It can be difficult to hold them accountable for their views. It can be difficult to even understand if some delegates are actually speaking for their membership or if they're just speaking for themselves. That's what accountability is, right? It's making sure that they are actually representing the views of their members, and carrying out the will of their members and communicating with their members and all that stuff. So decentralization is not a free-for-all. It doesn't mean that states and caucuses do whatever they want. It doesn't mean that delegates go and do whatever they want. We have to make sure that we're including everyone again in that process, that delegates represent folks. And if there's any sort of conflict between either two delegates or two members at the state level or whatever it is, that we support them through mediation processes, through restorative justice processes, that recall and things like that exist in for delegates, not only for the national committee, but also in all of the work committees where things happen that, you can recall a co-chair or something like that, right? If things are not happening. All of the parts and aspects of direct democracy that we talked about earlier, we need to make sure that that's happening in all of our states and our caucuses and our committees. And right now that's not consistently happening everywhere. Partly because some of our bylaws and rules and procedures and all don't actually require it, or are very vague about it, and even differ between committees and caucuses. So kind of normalizing that and making sure that there's a very good baseline that supports direct democracy is an important step forward. So I ran through the list. Do you have any things to add, Chris? I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I've literally seen strong parties fall apart over issues that just needed an outside mediator, right? But there aren't clear paths for that within the Green Party of the United States. We have a dispute resolution committee, but no party is required to participate, right? So if you go and say we have a problem with this, and the other party says I don't want to talk about it, then it's over, right? End of story. As far as the Green Party is concerned. The only other tool that the Green Party of the United States has is to fully deaccredit a member party or caucus, right? Which is often not, it's very rarely a rational response to a problem with an individual, for example. So the lack of that, and I talked about it earlier, right? This mirrors a lack of any kind of real restorative process throughout a society, throughout our government, throughout our civic world. These things just don't exist in our society. So we definitely need to work them out internally, because we're going to need them as we grow, right? If the Green Party wants to become a mass membership, right, large scale party, like we talked about, we're going to need education programs. We're going to need, kind of conflict resolution processes and institutions. We're going to need restorative justice processes, because like I said, we're living in society that lacks all of this, and it's created a culture that has a lot of reactionary thinking that we're going to need to address as people come into the party, right? And we can't just kick everyone out because they used to have this view, right? We need a way to work with people and move people through things. And where I think that the National Party could kind of play an institutional role in that, right? But the real work of that, again, this is about decentralization, happens on the local level, right? That's where people will actually listen to each other. That's where people have relationships outside of yelling at each other on a listserv or on social media, right? That's where we have common conditions and understandings that we can leverage to move through these things. So while there is a huge void on the national level of this stuff and of these resources to kind of be passed down, right? And Amy L. Sachs in the chat said that their chapter had to get a hold of a mediator from the outside to try to resolve things, and then that's what we need, right? But they shouldn't have to go outside. The National Party should have that. But kind of the double edge of, the other side of that coin is this work is best done at the local level. So even though there isn't that national, we should be trying to put these things in place on that local level. People's opinions are rarely changed by someone shouting at them over the internet. People's opinions tend to be changed by real world experiences that they or people that they love and care about have, right? I years ago I was organizing with a group, and one of our members was an ex-vet, an ex-military member, and had come from a traditionally far right-wing background. That's my child who's not happy. He's not going down tonight. But he'd come from this right-wing military background in a small town community. Well, one of his, close friends came out as trans, and he saw the entire community turn on this person. Right? He experienced the hatred that was coming from his own worldview, and it flipped a switch in him. Right? A switch that I could have never gotten by talking to him about political theory. Right? He had to experience it. And when I knew him, he was organizing within an anarchist organization. He was active. This was during the Trump regime, and he had, especially specifically during the big spike in attention on immigration issues and ICE raids. And this is a formerly far-right military member who had an open offer that if there was an undocumented person that needed a place, he had a place, and no one would ever find. He was out there publicly saying, "I will shelter you and I will keep them away," right? And that kind of change can only happen on that personal level, right? Something had to happen to him in his life, so that's where we have to do this kind of work locally, but GPUS could do a lot more in terms of just functional structures to work through these things. To outside mediators, too often we're trying to mediate our own things, and you cannot effectively mediate when you've got skin in the game, right? that creates biases.
One thing that I think all of these points kind of touch on, but it isn't a clear bullet point, maybe it should be added in the future, is how important it is to have a stable budget as one of the resources here, because a lot of what the National Party can and should do is to provide these structures and the infrastructure and the tools, and that could be technical tools like web tools and all to manage organizers and volunteers and all that stuff, but also tools in the sense of training, that we should be able to hire trainers and to pay to fly trainers, that the work happens locally, but we can send a trainer to your local party who can sit with you and meet with you and teach you the skills and to kind of walk you through the process and stuff. That way you're not felt left alone, because unfortunately that's what happens with a lot of local organizers, that you start off with a lot of momentum, and then if you feel like everything's on you and you're not getting any help, that's the road to burnout city. So part of us being a party, being a network, being a movement, and not just a little local community or local group or whatever, is being there to support each other. And one way that we do that is providing the budget and the resources to provide education and training, which of course can only happen if there is a solid budget. So that's another positive aspect of switching to the membership-based party, that not only is the structure more accountable directly to individual members, but we also have this solid funding base that the more our membership grows, the more we have this funding. And part of our promise is, if you become a member, we have all these resources for you. You can have the communication structure. You can have the trainer that'll fly out and help you once a year or whatever. You'll have someone help you with ballot access to give you training on that. All of the things that a party needs to get started with organizing.
Yeah, and I can speak from personal experience there. In Illinois, we were founded in the 90s as a dues-paying party. That was removed and moved to a sustainer model. And then in 2017 or 18, I don't remember which one it was, we moved back to a dues model. And what we've found is that our funding is much more stable, right? Under the sustainer model, we were often having more privileged and wealthy members bailing us out, right? I remember the turning point, kind of for that movement in my state was we were having a membership meeting, and at the fundraiser afterwards, the state party secretary at the time was talking about, was giving a fundraising pitch that was more of a shame pitch, because he said there are 12 people that give sustaining monthly payments to the party. There are 60 people in the room. You know who you are. And then he made his pitch for dues, and it passed. I don't believe it was unanimously, but pretty close. At the next meeting. So that the membership-based party provides a level of stability that allows us to plan for growth instead of going through these boom and bust cycles, which is what happens with the Green Party on the national level, where every 4 years there's a presidential cycle and we get a boom year, right? But then we go back to austerity budgets within a year or two later. I can also say, as a former GPUS committee chair, there's nothing more frustrating than someone coming to me and saying, I want to get involved in your committee and do work, and me having to say, you need to email your state party and get appointed, right? Literally turning people away. And I would usually engage them while they were going through that process, right? Like, let's get you involved, but you need to do this thing. So we're putting these bureaucratic barriers. And then, I think one of the really central key things is that communication line, right? We really have to improve communication through our, whether it's membership based or our current confederation, right? Changing that doesn't improve our communication automatically. It's a systems thing. It's a cultural thing. And we really need to address that so that when the National Committee does say we endorse the Earth Day to May Day movement, which seeks to connect the ecological and the economic justice movements in that about week between those two holidays, right? When we endorse that, it means that we are going to see states and parties putting things on a local level, that we are even going to see the National Party putting things on during that week, right? We need a culture where we're centering action at the end of everything we do, action steps and plans and strategies. So, there's a lot of ways that GPUS could be improved. Garrett and I and GSOP in general, if you look at our bylaws, it's explicitly in our bylaws that moving to a membership party is key, and it's a realization of decentralization. Right, to loop back to what we're talking about. That's what the dues membership system is. So I had actually I thought I'd moved those, but I didn't. So thank you very much, everybody. We're a little over an hour now. We went a little long. I think that it's important that we have conversations like this about decentralization and our key values. I think it's important that we have them in a critical way, right? Like we did tonight. We both criticize decentralization broadly and our own practice. Yet at the end, for all the reasons in the middle, for the effectiveness of decentralized organizing, for the actual democracy that decentralization provides, not only electorally and politically, but throughout our society in all sectors, and for how decentralized society is. It can be a radical transformation that can get us where we're trying to go. Despite all those flaws and for those reasons, Garrett and I are both pretty strong advocates of decentralization, right? No system is perfect. We're especially no system is perfect when being implemented by humans. Especially when those humans are all volunteers, especially when those volunteers wear too many hats, especially when those volunteers volunteer for an organization that doesn't have a whole lot of resources, right?
To kind of swing that a little bit more positive here, one aspect I'll kind of riff on what Chris said earlier about how important it is to think that we're organizing on a continental scale, and it's very big, and we have to kind of allow ourselves the room to understand that it's a very big job, and but we can get there together by building up this continental movement, starting from our local levels and connecting them together through things like the Green Party. And I think the aspect of that also is because we've all grown up under this system of capitalism. We have all lived under capitalism our whole lives. Like, it's not like the U.S. suddenly became capitalist last year or something, right? Like, our whole lives, our parents' lives, our grandparents, whatever, anyone who's been in the U.S., if your family's been in the U.S., you've lived under capitalism. And so that means that we've all grown up in this culture, this attitude, this political atmosphere that has encouraged us to think of democracy as the U.S. representative version, that you have only a very indirect say every 2 to 4 years on maybe sort of influencing a little bit if you're lucky enough to have a primary, which only a handful of districts do every election. And otherwise, you're not really involved. Your representative goes off and makes laws, and maybe you could call them and try to stop really horrible things, but you're generally not really involved. You're not expected to be involved. They think it's weird if you're involved, right? So the point is that we've grown up under this culture where we don't actually understand what democracy is because we don't live it every day. We don't practice it every day. We live under a very undemocratic, very anti-democratic society, despite how much the culture wants to pretend otherwise. So this is a learning process for us. We have to give ourselves the space to understand that we're learning democracy as we go. And that includes building democracy in political parties, in our community, in our workplace, healthcare and food co-ops, like whatever it is you're involved in, you try to practice democracy every day. And the more that we practice it, the more we're going to get better at it. That these complaints and criticisms are not, just to be mean or whatever, right? It's we've tried, and we tried, and here's some things that we've noticed, and if we address those, we'll get better at it. We'll get better at democracy. We'll get better at organizing, and we'll get better at moving toward the movement that we need. That's going to get the systemic change that we need.
And we have to get better,
right?
Because it's important for people to understand, right? The system that we live in and that we operate in under this authoritarian top-down system is working as designed, right? It was meant to alienate us from our representatives. It was meant to kind of segregate us from power, right? It's working exactly how it's designed, and we need to understand that, because when we're talking, whether we're really, no matter what issue we're talking about, right? When we get to kind of that point where it's like, well, do we want modest reform or do we want to take a new path, right? And when we have that, one of the things we have to, have this conversation about strategically when we're at that kind of fork in the road is, well, does the current path even allow for what we want, right? We can pass ranked choice voting, right? But if you're in a state like Illinois, where to run for Congress in my district as a Republican or Democrat, you have to collect 750 to 800 signatures. But to run as a Green, a Libertarian, or an Independent, you have to collect 16,000 signatures in 90 days from one mostly rural district. Ranked choice voting doesn't matter here because it'll only be the Republicans and the Democrats on the ballot, right? And even if we get on the ballot, it's still for first past the post single member districts where most people, where a large minority is unrepresented, right? And so when we think about these, the idea of forging a new path, right? Doing this really hard thing of, advocating and trying to put into place a transformational system, we have to understand that, the system that we have in place now isn't corrupted. It's acting as designed, right? Our system is not designed in any way to provide, where were they? Sorry. these, right? Our system is not designed to provide direct access and democracy. It's not designed to be participatory. It's not designed to be deliberative at the individual level. It is radical, but it's radical in the worst ways, right? It's radical in that it radically, sequesters power in the hands of the few, right? That's not the kind of radical we're talking about, but capitalism is radical.
Yeah,
for sure. It's extremist.
Neoliberalism is the radical idea that people with money should make all the decisions in all aspects of life.
Yeah. So we need to make sure we're remembering, right, that we're not just advocating for something new because we're curmudgeons, right? Or we're advocating for something new because what we have cannot allow for what we want. It cannot allow for what we're fighting for, and we can't keep. We frankly don't have the time to keep putting our energies into, outlets that don't actually end where we need them to end. In my time working as a community, I can tell you is people are ready for a new path. They're not really interested in someone trying to game the path better. They're not trying to get a slightly larger piece of the pie. They want to throw the pie out. This is why the largest voting bloc most elections is non-voters, right? They're not apathetic like people would like to paint them. They're alienated. They're alienated from power. They're alienated from being able to participate and being able to have a voice. And what they are ready for is something new. So it's up to us to build it. By doing it in a decentralized way, we buffer against a lot of the problems that are built in and by design in our authoritative system we have now. So with that, we're at an hour and a half. I do want to say that Amy Sachs said in the chat, I'd love a meeting where we could just troubleshoot what's specifically wrong in local chapters and celebrate what's gone well, right? And before we go, I do want to kind of bring this point up that we're building community, right? Whether at the local level or a national level in our collaborations. And we need this communication to be effective, right? But we also need it to grow as a community and kind of develop unified perspectives and unified strategies, right? We need to be able to share what works and what doesn't work. We need to be able to come to a group of experienced people and say, this is what's happening, and have someone say, well, we had that happen and tried this, don't do that, right? And another person say, we did this and it was okay, right? And work through some things. Right now, all we really have in that way is the National Committee, 160 people who are largely accountable to the members in their state. So I told Amy we actually tried that with our second Organizing 101 in 2022. Attendance wasn't great, but I'm more than willing to, even if it was just recurring, set up a organizer chat, right, where people came on and onto a Zoom and had a conversation. We could do it a lot of different ways, but I think that's important for that communication, but also just for building the relationships that we need to get this done and building the camaraderie and the solidarity. In my experience, the best ideas often come not in the meeting. They come at 2 a.m. after the meeting when you're sitting around. They come in a bar when someone says, hold on, I need to go find X and X. And then they come back and say, X and X are too drunk for this, but we need to talk about it tomorrow, right? That's when those good ideas come out, not necessarily in your business meeting. So I absolutely agree that, we need decentralization, the communication methods essential for decentralization have to be member to member as well, the individual member to individual member. So with that, we will be back next month on the fourth Tuesday, which is the 25th. We'll be doing Eco-Socialist Green New Deal 101. We will probably focus a lot more on kind of comparative and broad strokes of the Eco-Socialist Green New Deal that we developed in 2020, as opposed to very specific policy proposals. But that will be part of our Earth Day to May Day events that we're going to be doing that week. And so, yeah, if you want to learn more about these 101 series and the other stuff that we do, you can get involved in the Green Socialist Organizing Project at greensocialist.net. And we will see everyone next month. Have a good one. Thank you.